Arising from influences of the American Mafia, the United Kingdom spawned its own hard men, still to this day regarded as good-natured villains. The swinging 60s in Britain was darkened by death and extortion, from the Craig twins to the Great Train Robbery. But do these old dogs learn new tricks, as the wave once again rises in a new style of organized crime in Britain? One of the remarkable things about organized crime and the way it operates is how closely it mirrors a corporate world. It seems only a thin line separates legitimate business and the business of the underworld. After watching its enterprises prosper for 30 years, the mob in America by the early 1960s had to face a problem that confronts many legitimate businesses: the pressing need to expand their markets to ensure economic survival. In fact, it could be said the Mafia was one of the first American enterprises to go global, a trend that has brought together criminal groups from all corners of the earth. As the 1950s came to a close, the Mafia began for the first time to really feel the heat of law enforcement. The code of silence began to crack, and increasingly, American lawmakers and the American public began to peel away the mask that had long hidden the mob from scrutiny. With the election of John F. Kennedy as president and his brother Robert as Attorney General, the winds of change were blowing through America. Under increasing public scrutiny and increasing economic pressure to find new customers for criminal activities, the hunt was on to find new territories. This uncertainty at home, coupled with the loss of lucrative crime markets in nearby Cuba after the leftist revolution led by Fidel Castro, forced some Mafia bosses to think beyond the boundaries of America. They turned their gaze across the Atlantic to the green fields of England, a country that seemed naive by American standards and ripe for the picking. Meyer Lansky, the Mafia's financial brain trust, was a man heading the mob's push to set up business offshore. One of Lansky's most trusted deputies, Dino Cellini, who'd been banned from the Bahamas, was sent off to England. In London, Cellini ran a croupier school, cashing in on the boom in Britain, which followed the legalizing of gambling clubs. At the same time, one-time Hollywood motion picture star George Raft, who had long-time Mafia connections, also moved to Britain to run the Colony Club and act as an ambassador-at-large for the Mafia. The Americans had much to offer their English-speaking cousins across the Atlantic, especially when it came to the fine points of exploiting gambling, which had just been made legal in Britain. But the British authorities had other ideas, and most surely did not put out the welcome mat. After an initial slowness to act, authorities suddenly moved in the mid-1960s to deport both Dino Cellini and George Raft. The stately Dorchester Hotel in central London was a setting for an international crime convention in 1966. It was a meeting of the kings of crime, called to carve up the spoils in Europe and Britain. But the meeting had a downside, too, eventually leading to the deportation of Mafia members who'd been operating unhindered in Britain for some years. The Dorchester Hotel meeting brought together representatives of the Mafia in the United States, the French Mafia, the heads of British crime firms, and representatives of the Bali Corporation, which operated poker machines in both America and Britain.
Highly recommended for this market. Okay, you have any coffee?
Gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to say a fine welcome to our colleagues from France and Germany, members of our local firm in the Cray Lads, and a very special welcome to our friends from across the Atlantic, the Cosa Nostra. Now, gentlemen, we all know why we're here. so as to prevent any squabblings and bad feelings. We've all come round the table as civilised gentlemen to see who gets what. And believe me, there is plenty to go around.
The task was to work out how best each could exploit gambling, which had recently become legit in Britain, and how organized crime could gain control of gambling in Spain. What the crime bosses didn't know was that there was a spy in their midst. American lawyer Herbert Aitken had infiltrated the mob several years earlier and routinely reported back to the FBI. The intelligence gathered by Herbert Aitken at the Dorchester Hotel Convention of Crime led to pressure on the British government to deport Mafia figure Dino Cellini and American actor George Raft. Their forced departure left British authorities convinced the American menace had been driven off. The Mafia had not gained a foothold on British soil. Organized crime, however, was not dead. Britain's homegrown gang simply stepped into the Mafia's shoes, claiming the fields of crime and corruption all to themselves. By the early 1960s, Great Britain was awakening from the conservatism that had followed World War II. These were the swinging 60s, a time of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Looming large in the landscape of need and greed, two men the British underworld and the public alike called the Terrible Twins, Ronald and Reginald Cray. The Crays controlled half of the crime in London, while the Richardson gang mastered the rest. Ronnie and Reggie Cray were truly typical of criminals who grew up in post-war London. Tough, self-assured, resourceful, sometimes dangerous, and always able to exploit human weakness. Back then, Larry Pope was a raw recruit who just joined the police force. Now retired, he recalls how much of an impact the Crays had on London and police officers like himself.
The United Kingdom organised crime back in the 70s was, the face of it was the Cray twins type of crime. When it wasn't the violence amongst themselves, one of the most violent crimes we had in the 60s and 70s was bank robberies. There were other gangs around at the time. The names that come up are the Richardsons, pretty well known and recorded. There was other ones, the Tibbs brothers, I seem to recall, with a scrap metal yard. There were various ones on the ascent, and then things would happen, and they would either be neutralised by a police effort or neutralised by some other internal problem.
Professor of sociology at Durham University in England, Dick Hobbs, who's made a detailed study of British villains, says the Cray twins were heavily influenced by movies of American gangsters of the 1930s.
In many ways, what has to be remembered about the Cray twins is that they operated in the shadow of the Mafia. They liked the Mafia. They dressed like Chicago gangsters. Sometimes they talked like Chicago gangsters. They drove American cars. The American gangster model was an ideal type for people like the Cray twins to actually copy. And in many ways, if you look at them now, it makes them look utterly ridiculous. So I think the influence of the American Mafia on the British crime scene is mainly in terms of imagery rather than structure.
Dick Hobbs, who is the author of a book called Bad Business, which examines English criminals and their money-making rackets, believes the American Mafia never intended to directly control organized crime in the United Kingdom.
The American Mafia, American organised crime, has always had a presence in Britain. Certainly in the 1960s it had a presence in Europe, in London rather, as regards to gambling. And they were welcomed by the local villains because they brought with them a great deal of clout. They brought with them money, and also they brought with them a glamour that British organised crime has never had. So, for instance, in the Colony Club in London's West End, you had a situation there where George Raft, who was the American film star who was closely connected to the American mob, was almost resident there. A lot of Mafia money passed through the Colony Club. And I think that really that was an introduction to the way in which global organised crime was going to go in the future, in that you could have a presence, you could have a commercial presence, and you would have formal but mainly informal collaborations would be set up with local villains.
Even if the Mafia had wanted full control of Britain's underworld, it was unlikely they would have achieved that goal, according to investigative journalist and author on organised crime, Bob Baum.
It really epitomises a sort of a syndrome that's peculiar to the UK, and that is that the UK, as an old imperial power, may have sent people all over the world, but they don't take too kindly to whether it's the triads, American Mafia, or you know, Australian, or what they might call down under, you know, gangsters coming in, and that protects the patch of the organised type group.
To understand the workings of British organised crime, we have to go back to the docklands of London before World War II, when a man with the unlikely name of Billy Hill was the name in organised crime. Billy Hill was probably the best organised criminal Britain has ever had, maintaining a firm grip on illegal gambling dens and nightclubs in London by outthinking would-be rivals, and when necessary, using his not inconsiderable body bulk to instill fear. Hill, who died a millionaire at the age of 73, was a role model for a whole generation of villains, including Ronnie and Reggie Cray. Years later, in a book titled Villains We Have Known, Reggie Cray wrote that when he was 20, the man he most wanted to emulate was a former gang boss of London's underworld, Billy Hill.
Billy Hill was probably as near as we've got in Britain to a godfather of British crime. This guy was very, very clever. Involved in burglary, involved in receiving, involved in illegal drinking clubs, and also involved in gambling. And he taught the business of gambling to the Cray twins. And this coincided in the early 1960s with the Gambling Act, which made gambling legal. So suddenly these guys with a knowledge of gambling were able to go legitimate or semi-legitimate. And the Cray twins very, very quickly built up this reputation for themselves of running gambling clubs. But they could never let go. They could never let go of the illegal life. The illegal life, the life of the villain, is very attractive to young men, and certainly to the Crays. It was far too attractive to go legitimate.
In the 1960s, the influence of the Cray twins spread rapidly. Ronnie Cray was the public frontman, often photographed in nightclubs with entertainers and leggy showgirls. But it was all just show. Ronnie Cray was homosexual. Ronnie and Reggie Cray had an almost obsessive affection for their mother, Violet, a cheerful and strong-minded woman who largely brought the boys up on her own with the help from her eldest son, Charlie. Apart from their mother, the twins had another passion, boxing, something they shared with big brother Charlie. The twins showed real promise, and at 17 looked set for careers as professional fighters. But they were called up for military service, and the Army refused to let the twins work as physical fitness instructors. The pair spent most of the next 2 years either in the brig or on the run. They were now heading towards a life of crime. Discharged from the Army, the Crays took over a snooker club that was not only in financial trouble, but had patrons who did nothing but brawl. Within months, the Crays turned it around, and the rise up the ladder of London's underworld had begun. By 1959, Ronnie Cray's behavior became more and more bizarre. He was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, something that added to the Crays' reputation for violence. Ronnie was put on medication which he took all the rest of his life. Despite his mental illness, the Cray firm continued to prosper. They took over nightclubs and gambling lounges, largely thanks to the more serious and sane efforts of Reggie Cray. In 1963, the Cray twins, along with the rest of the nightclub set, watched the Profumo affair unfold. John Profumo, the senior minister in the Macmillan government, was exposed for his dalliance with call girls, Christine Keeler, a brunette beauty, and Mandy Rice Davis, a blonde bombshell. The girls, in turn, had links to a Soviet diplomat operating in Britain. The Profumo scandal had hardly subsided when Britain was rocked again, this time by an audacious military-style robbery of a train carrying millions of pounds worth of old notes, which were destined for destruction. The Cray twins had originally been offered a part in the robbery, but for reasons unknown, declined. On August 8, 1963, in the dead of night, a dozen villains held up the London to Glasgow mail train, and in just half an hour unloaded 2.5 tons of used banknotes, worth at least 60 million American dollars in today's money. For the Crays, it was fortunate they stayed out of the heist, for most of the villains were quickly rounded up and sent to jail for 30 years or more. Today, the gang nicknamed the Great Train Robbers are all either still in jail for other crimes or dead. All that is, except one, Ronald Biggs, who still lives in Brazil after fleeing there nearly 30 years ago following a prison breakout. For the Cray twins, the next big deal was involvement in a dubious housing project in Nigeria. That brought Ronnie Cray into contact with bisexual labor politician Lord Boothby. Ronnie wanted Boothby to help finance the unstable Nigerian project. One of Britain's tabloids got hold of pictures of the pair at a business meeting and ran the whole story under the banner, The Peer and the Gangster. Lord Boothby sued and got £40,000 damages. The publicity helped propel the Cray twins, especially Ronnie, to public notoriety. Despite widespread reportage of his homosexuality, Ronnie Cray was nevertheless touchy about his sexual tendencies. Villain George Cornell, a large bull-necked man who some described as a sick, sadistic bastard, enjoyed taunting Ronnie Cray about being gay. The Crays had another reason to dislike Cornell. They believed he was responsible for the earlier shooting death of their cousin, Dickie Hart.
And the Cray twins gradually built up a certain animosity to a rival gang on the south side of the Thames called the Richardson Brothers. It was heading for a war, for an all-out war between these two groups. And an old enemy of the Cray twins called George Cornell, who had allied himself to the Richardsons, was drinking in a pub in the East End called the Blind Beggar. Reputedly, George Cornell had said something to the words of that Ronnie Cray was a fat puff. Ronnie Cray got a gun, took his driver to the Blind Beggar pub.
Oh, hello, Ronnie.
He walked up to George Cornell. Cornell turned around and muttered something to him.
You puffed her, Ronnie. You've had enough of you.
Ronnie Cray shot him in the head. And sometime later he died in hospital.
Police wasted no time arresting Ronnie and Reggie Cray over the Cornell killing. But by now, the Crays' reputation both as ruthless men and celebrities preceded them. Witnesses to the slaying in the Blind Beggar Hotel either couldn't or wouldn't identify the Crays in a lineup. Authorities were left with no choice but to drop the case. The decision not to prosecute seemed to spur the Crays on to new excesses.
I think what's happened with the Cray twins in East London is they've become quite iconic figures. You know, we've had, I think at the last count, there was something like 15 books written about the Cray twins. There's a film, a feature film been made about the Crays featuring the Kemp brothers, a couple of pop stars. There are endless TV programmes about the Crays, and they've become cult heroes. They've become cult heroes because they seem to represent to people a kind of golden age of East London, a golden age of working class society where villains were villains, men were men, women knew their place, and disputes were worked out as men should work them out. This actually isn't true. I mean, the reason that the 60s were good for East London was there was full employment. Not because the Cray twins were walking the streets carrying Lugers.
In mid-1967, Reggie Cray's estranged wife, Frances, killed herself by overdosing on pills. Her death had a profound effect on Reggie, plunging the normally sensible and placid Reg into a deep depression. That depression ultimately led to the self-destruction of the Cray twins' crime empire. Reggie Cray started drinking heavily and became morose, plotting the death of fellow villain Jack the Hat McVitie, who was not much more than a hanger-on in the Cray gang. Jack the Hat, who never took his hat off because it hit a bald patch, irritated Reggie because he was a loudmouth, a drunk, a drug taker, and a woman basher. In the autumn of 1967, Jack the Hat was invited to a party in Stoke Newington. It was to be his last. Waiting for Reggie Cray, who plunged the knife deep into the unsuspecting Jack McVitie. The murder of Jack the Hat was the last straw for the British establishment, which until now had put up with the Cray brothers' antics. In the spring of '68, police swooped and arrested both Ronnie and Reggie Cray for the murders of Jack McVitie and George Cornell. Once it was obvious the Crays were in real trouble with the law this time, many of their criminal cohorts gave evidence against them.
If you look at the organisation of the Cray twins, the Cray twins had back in the 60s, for instance, you had the twins at the top, then there were 2 or 3 lieutenants under them, and then after that it was a completely disorganised, mutating group of mainly of hangers-on. If you look at the way that the Crays were wiped out or dealt with by the authorities, by the police, however, that's quite interesting, is that once they got 1 or 2 informants within the so-called structure of the Cray twins enterprise, then the whole structure collapsed. It went very, very quickly.
Ronnie and Reggie Cray were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 30 years to serve. The twins were 35 years old and had no prospect of being free again until the turn of the century. Walk into the Blind Beggar pub today, you'll not only find the decor unchanged from the 60s, but also the attitudes to these local folk heroes called the Cray twins. If you're lucky, you may get the Ronnie Cray George Cornell shooting fully described, or you may get silence. We found the Blind Beggar regulars willing to describe just a little of that fateful day.
People still do come in just to take pictures and ask the same questions you're asking. Where was Georgie Cornell shot? And they still get the same answer. He was shot in the head. But most of us don't talk about it because it's a long time ago and it was just one incident. That's all. Too much has been made of it.
I didn't know them personally, but I've been told that they really did help out the elderly people in the East End. They looked after them financially, made sure that nobody was bothering them. I know they were known as villains, which they probably were, but they looked after their own people, and that's what counts, looking after your own. There's a lot of people say it's a pity that the Crays weren't around now, that they would certainly stop a lot of the violence that's going on around here.
I accept the observation that was made, and it was made to me as a police officer, that the Crays were good to their own community. People felt that whilst the Crays were running the show, if you like, in the East End, then others weren't. And because the Krays were recognised as being in the more top echelon of criminality, then they wouldn't allow other persons to steal from or damage or injure persons who lived in that same area. I think that was more myth than reality. We did have a lot of assaults and ordinary crime, just not the same degree as we have today. It was a myth. It was a bit of a Robin Hood myth or any other Dick Turpin type thing. As a police officer, of course, Robin Hood, Dick Turpin, any of them you like, they're just downright crooks. And, I have no fondness for them at all.
In March 1995, Ronnie Kray died of a heart attack in Broadmoor Prison at the age of 61. His funeral turned into one of the biggest public events East End London had ever seen. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary people lined the streets to say farewell to Ronnie. When he was younger, Ronnie told his twin brother that when he died, he wanted his coffin drawn by 6 black horses. Reg Kray made sure his brother's wish came true.
You all right?
Yeah. Ronnie Kray left this world a working-class hero. His brother laid to rest. Reggie Kray was returned to Maidstone Prison to see out the last years of his 30-year sentence. While the Krays were on the inside, on the outside, the whole world had changed forever. Very little remained of what was London in the swinging 60s, when Reggie and Ronnie Kray were the Mr. Biggs of the underworld. Even the Dockland, the heart of the Krays' working-class territory, is different. Smart townhouses now stand where rundown warehouses once stood. The personal computer has replaced the shotgun as a weapon of choice for villains in today's Britain. Even crime itself has changed. It has become a mega business, and drugs are the holy grail.
The real difference between them and now is the marketplace. The amount of money that there is to be made from crime now is absolutely enormous. If you look at the Kray twins, for instance, in the 1960s, although they were regarded as the kings of the London underworld, if you look at the amount of money they actually made from it wasn't very much at all. If you look at the amount of money which is available now in the criminal marketplace, it is fantastic, and that's mainly due to the drugs trade. From the mid-1970s onwards, the drugs trade expanded at such a rate, and the demand for recreational drugs expanded at such a rate that there is far more money involved now. I think you can compare it to the computing industry. If you go back to the early 1970s, computing industry in Britain was very, very small, and there wasn't that much money in it. Now it's absolutely enormous. We've all got computers on our desks, we've all got computers in our homes. Similarly with drugs. Drugs are everywhere now. Drugs are consumed by a considerable proportion of the British population, and the marketplace to provide those drugs is absolutely huge. So I think drugs is very big.
Law enforcement in Britain couldn't agree more. The drug trade is a vast moneymaker and a major problem. The director of Britain's National Crime Intelligence Service, Vincent Harvey.
He's been saying heroin has become a much more fashionable, a much more acceptable drug over the last few years. Cocaine is also a steady drug. We have a lot of that coming over. Crack came over something like, I would guess, 10 years ago. We didn't have the crack explosion that was forecast, but it has slowly and insidiously spread throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. We can find pockets of people taking crack all the time. And of course, what these people generally do is mix their drugs. You know, the incredible high they get from something like crack. A lot of people will then take some heroin after that in order to prolong that. It gives you a longer lasting blast and escape from reality. So we're quite heavily users of all those powder drugs. Very worrying for us in the UK, of course, is that we're probably the world's largest market for synthetic drugs, the amphetamines and ecstasy, LSD, and well, there's a whole raft of these. I won't go through all the titles, but yes, for the synthetic and manufactured drugs, we're a very large market, structured a lot around some of the club and dance culture for things like ecstasy, but also amphetamines and the others, as I say, have become very popular.
Drugs trade in Britain does reign supreme in terms of organised crime. It is different from the US in that the drugs which are used. I mean, for instance, in this country, in Britain, throughout the 1990s, ecstasy has been a very, very important drug as part of youth culture, and therefore as part of the organised criminal culture and the organised criminal business. If you look at the US, it's nowhere near as central to youth culture or to the business. So each marketplace, each criminal marketplace, does generate its own kinds of practices, and it is different not only in different countries but in different parts of the country. There are parts of Britain, for instance, that does not have a cocaine culture, where cocaine isn't popular. There are other parts of Britain where cocaine is very popular. And again, it's to do with the marketplace. If you look at the price of cocaine, it's the same price now as it was 10 years ago. In fact, it's marginally cheaper. It was £50 10 years ago, £50 a gram 10 years ago. It's now down to about £40 a gram. Well, that's not expensive. 10 years ago, it was regarded as quite expensive. So you've got fashion, you've got prices, you've got trends which emerge in the criminal marketplace in the same way that they do in the legitimate marketplace.
One of the biggest single factors influencing organized crime in Britain and the rest of Europe was the collapse of communism. Not only did the political walls come tumbling down, but so too the economic divide between East and West. With every symbolic blow of the hammer, Europe began the process of unification. One market, one currency, one Europe, and one large new target for organized crime.
The organised crime market is like the legitimate crime market. It's gone global, and that's mainly because of drugs. So that if anyone wants to be involved in the drugs trade in Britain now, they are going to have some link with overseas crime groups. That's the way it is. And it's certainly the case that in Britain we do have every nationality has its own crime group. Whether you talk about Lebanese, Russian, Colombian, German, they've all got their own crime group, and there will be an influence upon British society. However, it's very important that we stress that the majority, the huge majority of organised criminals in Britain are indigenous, they're homegrown. We haven't got Russian criminals on the streets. There are no burglars called Boris, for instance. We have, we've got our own burglars, we've got our own drug dealers. But certainly I think what we have seen is the influence of foreign organised crime money on our streets.
Countries like Holland, Belgium, Germany, and France have all had to adapt to the new Europe. And that means even illegitimate business or organised crime has faced increased competition from what used to be Eastern Bloc Europe. Britain's National Criminal Intelligence Service believes that crime in the United Kingdom has changed so much in recent years that what they're dealing with now is essentially Euro crime.
Predominantly, as I say, it is British criminals who run the organised crime within the UK. We have several other groups. The largest groups are those of we refer to them as Turkish groups, but they're all from that part of Europe. They're responsible pretty much for the majority, something like 90% of the heroin importations. And of course, heroin is the big trade at the moment and the big profit maker. And we're seeing increasing signs of other nationalities coming over. And each ethnic group is bringing its own crime. I mean, we're seeing that on illegal immigration, for example. Certain groups are bringing in people from their own area of the world where they've come from.
Belgium-based criminologist Cyril Finot says there are signs that crime has gone global, especially the Russians. But he cautions against exaggeration of the threat.
Many people are talking about the threat of the Russian mob, of the Russian red mafia. And indeed, and also in northwestern Europe, we see clear signs of that, particularly in the forms of killings and cases of extortion, and to some extent money laundering operations, and particularly in those cities or those regions where you have already traditionally a more or less large Russian community. That makes it, of course, quite easy for Russian mobsters to hide away and to build up a foothold in foreign countries. But to say that the Russian or the Red Mafia is really a big threat for Germany or for Holland or Belgium, that would be an enormous exaggeration. If you would take the last analysis prepared by the Belgian police authorities, or the Dutch ones, or the German ones, and then you would come, I guess, to the conclusion that nearly 5, 6, 7% of the cases they have dealt with are related to Russian organized crime.
Professor Dick Hobbs of Durham University echoes his sentiments about overemphasizing the threat from abroad.
You know, we need to be very wary of blaming organised crime on foreign nationals. And it is a tendency you can see in some parts of the police force, of the British police force. If you blame foreign nationals for organised crime, it creates more of a shock, it creates more of a panic, and the chances are that your budgets are likely to go up to deal with this terrible problem that's coming from overseas, as opposed to dealing with quite mundane, boring, indigenous criminals who have been around for an awful long time. There's not a really good story there. So I think we need to be wary of screaming that the aliens are coming every few weeks, when actually we've got a good mixture of villains in this country. Some of them happen to be foreign, but the large bulk of them are homegrown.
Across the English Channel, it seems homegrown is also the catch cry of organized crime. As author of numerous books on the underworld, Bob Bottom explains.
The French underworld, not the underground, but the underworld, is pretty powerful in its own right. And I don't think that there'll be much room for any other outsiders to emerge to any great extent, except that where appropriate you'll find that French criminals may link up with some from Italy or Belgium, or in particular sometimes with those in Britain, to pull off something. It may well be sometimes more in the realm of a bank heist or some commercial fraud, but generally speaking, in organised crime terms, they run their own race on their own soil.
According to Professor Dick Hobbs, criminals operating in a Europe with no borders simply cannot afford to remain insular.
So the borders coming down have had an influence. It's easier to get around in Europe now. It's easier to get stuff across borders. In terms of policing, however, there are real problems there in that the European Union is trying to adapt to the new criminal opportunities which are coming up, but you've got so many different jurisdictions there. We're a long way from getting to the point where police in Europe can cross borders and cross jurisdictions with the same impunity that organised criminals can cross jurisdictions and cross borders.
When the barriers came down between East and Western Europe, it signaled a rise in the fortunes of extreme right-wing groups. Behind the facade of racism, though, often stood good old-fashioned criminal thugs, taking advantage of people's fears and frustrations. Some social scientists believe Europe today has all the makings for a real problem in the future, with a growing number of street gangs. Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California, Professor Malcolm Klein, who has spent a lifetime studying gangs in America and elsewhere, says Europe is something of a paradox.
We've been looking at the gang situation in Europe fairly recently, the last several years. I've had a chance to be over there and visit some of the cities and see what's going on. We talk about the Eurogang paradox, which really means that many European cities, many European officials are denying that they have street gangs because they say, well, they don't look like the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles, or they don't look like the Latin Kings and the Gangster Disciples in Chicago. Therefore, we don't have gangs. The fact is, of course, that in America, most American gangs don't look like that either. So when you look at the real structures of American gangs, these informal structures, these informal youth gatherings, if you will, and then you look at those groups in Europe that have been developing over the last 10 years or so, you find that Europe does have street gangs in some of its cities. We've identified, I have to count, but 12 or 15 cities that have street gang problems in Europe now, some of them surprising. But on the other hand, there are many, many, many cities in Europe, far more than in the US, that don't have street gangs. So it's a fairly new phenomenon. They're not well organized. They're not involved in the drug trade. They have very few firearms, and that's a major difference from America. We've been talking with European researchers and in fact trying to get more of them involved in looking at the street gang situation in order to get a sense for what the European gang looks like, never mind whether or not it fits the American tradition, but to take advantage of American data to start them off. There is a growing problem in Europe, and if European cities continue to develop urban underclass problems with their refugee and immigrant groups, they will continue to increase their gang problems.
However, European crime expert Professor Cyril Finot feels Europe does not yet have a problem of America's magnitude.
We are not confronted with such gang problems here in Western Europe. Neither in Amsterdam, neither in Paris, nor in Berlin or in Brussels or anywhere. That doesn't mean that we don't have gangs here. And we see the last 10, 15 years, and we've seen, let's say, the beginning of such a development. And not only in immigrant communities, but also in the domestic population. And we see indeed that in some quarters of big cities, we see indeed that boys, sometimes girls, group together, try to build up something like a gang, commit crimes in such a context. But this large gang problem linked to organized crime, to established organized crime families, like, for example, in the Chinese community in the United States or in the Vietnamese community, that is a thing we don't see here up to this moment.
European authorities are taking what may be a more conciliatory attitude than that shown by law enforcement in the United States.
Most European countries have taken a different approach to delinquency and crime generally than we have. They're much less punitive than we are. They're much more concerned with social service aspects. For instance, in several European countries, kids don't get turned over to law enforcement until they're at least 16 years old. The police simply cannot handle them. They have to turn them over to social service agencies and community committees. So their whole approach to working with young people is somewhat different from ours, and this will affect the way in which they're going to handle their gang problems.
Street gangs are one of the very public faces of organized crime, doing deals openly on the streets, drugs, counterfeiting, and strong-arm tactics. But there is also a quiet face to crime in Britain and Europe. So important financially is that gray zone of business where the illegal and legal meet, that whole communities thrive only because of what's called the night economy.
What we've seen since the late 1980s is a real revolution, I think, in organised crime in Britain, and that is the emergence of a nighttime economy. In cities in Britain which were basically shut down after 6 o'clock at night, cities which were built upon a Victorian industrial past, and that industry is now gone. We live in a post-industrial age. The only way in which they can attract money, attract inward investment, is by developing a nighttime economy. Now that nighttime economy is now riddled with organised crime, whether it's bouncers running the door, whether it's the provision of drugs, whether it's the provision of criminal services generally, or whether it's as an outlet to launder illegal money through. The nighttime economy, clubs, pubs and bars has become a very important outlet for organised crime to develop. And I think we're going to see that's going to go on in the years to come.
But Professor Cyril Finot feels that the so-called underground economy is somewhat overestimated and overemphasized.
Never dare to support this thesis. And even in Italy, where you have where the mafia groupings, particularly in the southern part of Italy, to some extent really control the economic activities in cities. And there, of course, you have a big problem. Like in the big cities in the United States, where Cosa Nostra families control the transport sector or the waste disposal sector or the construction industry. There, of course, you have a huge problem. But that is not a problem that is common in Western Europe these days.
Organized crime has always had a sinister ability to feed off human weakness. As long as people have unfulfilled needs, then it seems organized crime will always be close by, motivated by greed, ready to make desire reality at a price. British and European crime firms have, like old dogs, learned new tricks to meet new customer demands in a changing world. A world where crime knows no boundaries, where crime truly is big global business. I'm Robert Stack. Thanks for joining.